Chapter 16. Nips and Sips. At first, Justine had no idea why they had gone to a misogynistic gross factory like Nips and Sips to celebrate the night's unexpected victories. Richard had made the suggestion and then peeled off in Brad's muscle car before she or Chuck could counter with something more reasonable. After Chuck finished patching up Justine's knees and his own hand with a first aid kit, and they got to the new location, things started to make a little more sense. The standalone restaurant was located in a shopping plaza's parking lot. The plaza was anchored by an independent movie theater. Even late at night, Nips and Sips was well lit and well trafficked. Despite the knockoff Hooters' toxic reputation, it was a mainstream commercial location that left Justine feeling like she probably wouldn't be jumped in the parking lot. So, yeah, late-night drinks in a safer environment than Terry's hole. Maybe Nips and Sips wasn't as mystifying as she first thought. On their way inside, Justine glanced at the movie theater's marquee. It advertised a peculiar double feature: John Carpenter's The Thing and Jim Carrey's The Mask. The lights around the marquee blinked, and Justine could see people at the concession stand inside. Entering Nips and Sips, Justine's gaze was immediately drawn to the hostess's ludicrously large and extremely erect nipples underneath her thin, white-ribbed tank top. She couldn't help it. They were right there. The hostess had a pink name tag with her name printed underneath the restaurant's logo. Not that Justine paid any attention to the name tag when those nipples were practically giving a standing ovation, probably for their own impressive performance. Justine appreciated a good pair of sexy nips as much as the next person, but this took a running leap over the line and dropped a grenade in its wake. Fucking gross. When she tore her eyes away, she saw that Chuck was having the same magnetic reaction, but Richard seemed indifferent. He was scanning the pink-themed dining room, cluttered with risque pinup memorabilia and a massive, ostentatious aquarium taking up a whole wall, and he had been oblivious to the nipples screaming, begging, for attention right in front of him. The hostess scooped up a handful of menus and started into the dining room. "Right this way, guys." Can we sit over there?" Richard pointed to a series of booths in the opposite direction. The shouting Nips got quieter as Justine watched the hostess confer with a seating chart, chewing over the apparently complicated request. After an interminable moment, she nodded enthusiastically and led the way. Justine watched Chuck's eyes widen as he studied the curve of the girl's exposed butt cheeks underneath those absurdly short pink shorts. Richard, as before, remained oblivious. As they walked to their table, Justine followed Richard's gaze to a tall blonde carrying a tray of drinks. She wore the same white tank top and pink shorts as the hostess. It took Justine only a second longer to make the connection. While Richard had told her plenty about his roommate and obsessive love interest, Justine had only bothered to look her up once about a year earlier. She took one passive scroll of Tess's Instagram feed and then promptly forgot about it. Tess Taylor was little more than another copy-paste, basic blonde white bitch obsessed with perfect makeup, perfect boyfriends, and perfect photos for social media. Every picture on her Instagram was the same carefully curated bullshit Justine had seen on hundreds, thousands of other feeds. Aside from her figure, Justine had no idea what Richard saw in Tess, and she couldn't help but think less of him for harboring such a high school infatuation. And then, like the Instagram feed itself, Justine promptly forgot about the whole thing. But there she was, the object of Richard's ultimate desire. A fucking nipply waitress at a gross Hooters knockoff. Justine liked Richard more than she ever let on. It was hard not to. They worked in close proximity all day long, every day. They shared the highs and lows of work, life, and most everything in between. Justine was 2 years older than Richard and had more real-world corporate experience than he did. After all, while he was getting a fancy college education, Justine was putting her high school diploma to work in Vector's mailroom, working diligently to offset her father's back surgery and subsequent medical bills. Justine never had money for college, time for romance, or friends to socialize with. She was too busy working, and eventually, her dedicated work ethic carried her all the way to the executive suite and Dorian King's office. When Richard showed up alongside Lorraine Dillon, she had been about as indifferent to him as he was to their hostess's ridiculous nipples. When Lorraine arrived, Justine instinctively didn't trust her, and that distrust extended to the people Lorraine had brought up with her. But after a few weeks, and after spotting a scale model of Deep Space Nine's honorary starship, the Defiant, hidden under Richard's computer monitor, the new boy had begun to look a little more interesting. He was soft-spoken, sensitive, and had a sharp creative instinct that belied a more extraordinary, untapped talent. Richard was good to look at, fun to talk to, and the best thing to happen at Vector Defense since Justine started working for Dorian King. But sometimes Richard made it really hard for Justine to not dismiss him as just yet another dick-packing fuckwad. Of course, Richard noticed every single detail about the hostess. After all, it was hard not to. Those outfits left little to the imagination, and the whole business model of Nips and Sips was based on how horny they could make their customers. So, yes, he noticed. But the hostess wasn't why he had suggested the restaurant. She was little more than a cheap imitation of Tess's Nips and Sips clad perfection. Not that the monster cock knew any difference. Not that the monster cock cared. It vibrated in Richard's pants, twisting down a leg and throbbing until a drop of liquid warmth ran down his thigh. Puerile thoughts materialized in his brain, begging to bend the hostess over the railing, pull that thread of pink fabric aside, and split her in fucking two. He wanted to chew on those nipples, never mind they were prosthetic, and fuck her until she exploded, spraying a massive nut all over her cleavage until Tess came over and, in a fit of jealousy, began slobbering all over his monster cock while the hostess peeled down Tess's shorts. They were sat at a booth, and Richard took the side across from Chuck and Justine. He was grateful for the coverage of the table as the monster cock bulged and squirmed, eager for any kind of action it could get. "Bryce will be over in just a second to get you started with drinks," the hostess said, handing them menus. "Enjoy!" Richard couldn't hide a flash of disappointment. He had seen Tess serve the table behind them, so he thought they were in her section. "First round is on me, my friends," Chuck proclaimed. He raised a bandaged fist and shook it in the air. "Tonight, we celebrate!" He immediately winced and held his hand to his chest. "Yeah, but gently." Justine twisted in the booth to face Chuck, intentionally turning away from Richard. He was so preoccupied with staring at Tess. What the fuck did he think would happen? Was she going to suddenly notice him, drop to her knees and start blowing him? Disappointed in Richard and this predictable turn of events, Justine shoved all thoughts of her colleague aside, focusing instead on something that had bothered her since they departed Terry's hole. Okay, explain why you have such a massively well-stocked first aid kit in your van, please? Chuck shrugged. I was a part-time EMT for a hot minute. Despite their shared experience in the bowels of Vector, their paths had never crossed in the mailroom. Just the same, Justine had always felt a kinship with Chuck. It certainly didn't hurt that they'd just fought off a psychopathic gun nut together. Always surprised by the man, Justine was now impressed. For real? Chuck nodded. Yeah, you learn to be prepared, especially in the car. I mean, come on. Roads are nothing more than death traps, with literal tons of machinery being haphazardly navigated by very dumb, very distracted humans. Justine quickly eyeballed Richard, saw he was still looking at Tess, and turned back to Chuck. Fuck it. At least Chuck was interesting. How does one decide to become an EMT? Chuck laughed as a memory came back to him. Oh, I was so concerned about trying to balance my scales after Africa, but maybe I already had a little karmic credit stored up. Interesting and utterly mystifying. What the hell was he talking about? Justine chuckled. On a good day, I usually understand about half of what you say, but right now, you have completely lost me. Richard was barely listening. He was too busy scanning the dining room. When Bryce arrived at their table, Richard tried looking around her until the monster dick started twisting aggressively. Bryce was a red-haired copy of Tess, and the monster dick immediately wanted to slither up one of those long, muscular legs and start humping it voraciously. Richard dropped a hand underneath the table, pressing it hard into the pulsing penis, only to be rewarded with an explosion of tingling pleasure radiating up from his crotch. Hey, you with us, buddy? Richard swallowed and looked at Chuck. What? Chuck grinned and pointed at the waitress. You wanna tell her what you want? Richard blinked, confused. Chuck raised his eyebrows. To drink. Richard cleared his throat and pointed at Chuck. I'll have what he's having. Chuck handed his menu to Bryce, putting on a silly voice. And I'll have what she's having. Justine laughed. The waitress looked confused. Richard continued searching the dining room for Tess. When Bryce departed, Richard caught a glimpse of her pink-clad ass cheeks, and the monster cock pressed harder against his pants. Chuck and Justine continued their conversation. It was a few years after Africa. What were you doing in Africa? Justine asked. Yeah, another story, he said, waving it off. But after Africa, I was on the freeway one day when I saw a motorcyclist get cut off by some asshole in an SUV the size of a small tank. There was a multi-car pileup, and right when you thought the guy in the motorcycle was gonna be okay, kablammo! His leg gets severed clean off, right above the knee. Holy fuck! Justine breathed. Yeah, I was able to find his femoral artery and pinched it off until the emergency responders arrived. Chuck held up his hand and squeezed his thumb and index finger together. Try holding that tight for 15 minutes, or even 5. My fingers had never been so sore. The paramedics said that I single-handedly kept that guy alive. Holy shit, Justine said. More like single-fingeredly or whatever. They laughed. Richard paid them no attention. Well, after that, Chuck continued, I did the whole EMT thing for a bit, and I've had the first aid kit in the van ever since. Richard could feel their eyes on him, but he had spotted Tess as she was bringing a tray of food to the table behind them. When she got close, Tess's eyes finally met his. She was surprised to see him, smiled, and then looked strangely awkward before dropping off the food. Was she embarrassed for him to see her at her job? When she moved past Richard's line of sight, he turned forward and found Chuck and Justine staring at him. Yeah, they knew what was up. Chuck grinned and shook his head. Justine looked annoyed. She silently mouthed, "Really, dude? Really?" Richard opened his mouth to try and explain, but he had no words. Not that it mattered. The table behind them was getting loud. "Come on, sweetie," someone behind Richard said. "I got a little bit of the front, now give me some of that tail." "Please, sir." Tess's voice was unmistakable. "You should pretend you're in a museum." "Aw, fuck those snooze factories." "Look but don't touch." Another voice. "Where's the fucking fun in that? You have the loveliest, tightest piece of trim." Richard stared at Chuck, who in turn was looking right past him, watching what was happening at the other table. He could see it plainly all over Chuck's face. The fucker was groping Tess. The monster cock throbbed, and a rage that bristled inside him made his blood run hot. Chuck stood up from the table, rubbing his chin with his bandaged hand, intentionally showing off his battle scars. "Sir, I think the lady asked you to keep your hands to yourself." The monster cock twitched and vibrated with fury. Richard's fists clenched into small, tight balls. He didn't know what was more infuriating, a stranger's hands groping Tess, or Chuck standing up and saying something first.